A couple of weeks ago, I went to Walmart and I was grocery shopping, and I noticed as I walked in on the grocery side of the store, there was a woman standing in the produce section who was dressed in gold from head to toe. She had a cowgirl hat on that was covered with gold glitter shining under those fluorescent lights. She had a denim jacket that was covered with gold sequins such that she sparkled with her every move. And she had on pants that were made of some sort of shiny gold material too. I didn't get a look at her shoes, but I have to assume that they were probably gold as well. This lady was not trying to go unnoticed. She wasn't being subtle about being in Walmart that day. But the funny thing was that the gold outfit was just the beginning. Because after I'd been in the store for 45 seconds to a minute or so, I suddenly started hearing singing, loud singing. And I realized it was the same woman. And she was singing Christian hymns and praise songs in Walmart for everyone to hear. Now, not like stationed someplace, certainly not on a stage or with a microphone. She was pushing her cart and she was shopping. But she was singing praise songs loud enough for everybody in the store to be able to sing along. Now, she was an impressive singer. She had a strong operatic voice that would have wowed any one of us if she was part of the praise team at church helping to lead us in worship. But she wasn't on stage at church. She was in the produce section. She was holding asparagus, and she was singing, "This Little Light of Mine," and "Jesus Loves Me," loud enough for anybody to hear, probably about as loud as a person can sing. And when we found ourselves on the same aisle of the grocery store at one point, I noticed she had a poster standing up in her cart that she had prepared and brought with her that just said three simple words: "I love Jesus." And I listened to her sing. And I thought to myself, I love Jesus too. But I wonder what it was that accounted for the difference between the way that she and I expressed our love for Jesus that day. For the past couple of weeks, we've been in a series of messages here at Heritage that I've called Wholehearted. And what we're talking about is growing in our devotion to God. One of the most common misunderstandings that I see about Christianity is people assume or believe or have somewhere along the line picked up the idea that what God wants from us is a decision. That all God wants for us is a mental assent to a belief system, to an agreement with something, that what God is after is for us to make a decision to believe. But the reality is that a decision to believe is only the starting line for the life of faith. And the real goal that God has in mind is for us to live a life of devotion as a result of our decision. And so we know, based on our study over the past few weeks, and also based on our own experience, we know that there are always other priorities in this life that will compete with our attention. Other distractions that are going to try to take our priority away, that are going to try to lead us in a different direction than being devoted to God. But Jesus' teaching is telling us that the goal of this life is to love God with everything we've got, to put God first, to be devoted to God. And today, as we wrap up this series, I want us to think a bit about what that looks like, about what it looks like to be devoted to God. Because on the journey of faith, it's easy to get sidetracked if you aren't clear about where you're headed. You can be in this spiritual experience, this spiritual journey of trying to be a Christian, but if you don't have some clarity about what it looks like to be a devoted disciple, if you don't have some clarity about the goal and the target that you're aiming for, then it can be really easy to find yourself heading in a direction that looks like discipleship, but is actually nothing of the sort. And so if you've got a Bible with you this morning, I would love for you to join me in John chapter 12, the text that we're going to explore together today. John is the fourth book in the New Testament portion of your Bible. John was one of Jesus's original followers, one of the first people that Jesus called and said, "Come and follow me. Leave the rest of your life and occupation behind and come and follow me." And John became one of Jesus's closest friends, and this book that we call John is John's account of the life that Jesus lived. Now, if you've heard me preach for a long time, you know there are 4 different accounts from 4 different writers in the New Testament who all wrote their own perspective, their own account of what Jesus' life was like, but John's was particularly unique. John spoke as someone who was in the inner circle. John wrote as someone who had been there and seen that and heard that and witnessed everything that was so magnificent about Jesus' life and ministry. John was somebody who was able to see some of the deeper theological themes and the meanings of the things that Jesus was doing, and he created something that was a work of art, something that was unique from the other gospel writings. And so the events that we're going to read about in chapter 12 are actually connected to a big event that happened in chapter 11 when Jesus raised his friend Lazarus from the dead. If you were to glance back at chapter 11, you would see that Jesus received word while he was out doing ministry, while he was preaching far away from the capital city of Jerusalem. He received word that his friend Lazarus had become gravely ill, and Jesus decided that it was time for him to travel to Lazarus' hometown, to Bethany, which was really just a suburb on the perimeter of Jerusalem. It was time for Jesus to go to Bethany and pay his friend and his family a visit. But when he announced his plan to travel to Bethany, Jesus' disciples tried to talk him out of it. They reminded him that the last couple of times that they had found themselves even in the vicinity of Jerusalem, there were crowds of people there who had tried to kill Jesus, who had picked up stones and started throwing rocks at Jesus, and he only escaped by miraculous intervention. He only escaped because of his divinity. He only escaped because there were all of these people who believed that his claims to be the Son of God were equivalent to blasphemy. And so they tried to talk him out of going. All of Jesus' friends, including John, said, "We shouldn't do this. Don't you remember what happened the last time we were there?" But Jesus would not be persuaded not to go. And so the disciples reluctantly agreed. They said, "Okay, we'll go with you." But the reality was that they were still skeptical about how this would turn out. In fact, John chapter 11 tells us that Thomas, one of the other disciples close to Jesus, told the rest of the disciples in the group, he said, let us also go with him to Jerusalem so that we may die with him. They assumed that making this trip was a decision to go and sacrifice his life. And I tell you that to let you know that everyone in Jesus' orbit knew that traveling to the vicinity of Jerusalem was a dangerous move for Jesus. They didn't want to see him do this, but he decided to go anyway. And when he arrived, when he got to Bethany after making this long journey, traveling on foot for a couple of days, he found that his friend Lazarus had already died. In fact, his body had been in the tomb for 4 days already. But all it took was a command from Jesus. 3 little words. Jesus said, "Lazarus, come out." And his friend breathed again and came walking out of the tomb, still wrapped in the grave clothes in which he had been buried. And that's the kind of thing that word gets around about, right? That's the kind of thing that people don't keep to themselves. Word gets around about something like that. And so when people heard or when people saw what Jesus had done, there were many people who became convinced that he was exactly who he said that he was. There were people who, prior to that day, didn't believe Jesus' claims about divinity, about being the heavenly Son of God, but after they saw what happened with Lazarus, after they witnessed what happened in Bethany or heard a firsthand account about it from somebody else, they decided, well, he must be the one. There were people who became convinced to be disciples, but word spread to Jerusalem as well, and the religious authorities who were convinced that Jesus was a heretic, they decided then and there that they could not allow his influence to continue to grow, or it was going to threaten their entire religious system. It was going to threaten peace with the Roman governors who were in the area. It was going to threaten all of the stability of everything that they had built in their desire to honor God. And so they determined it's time for us to find a way to kill Jesus. And they put out an APB. They said, if anybody knows where Jesus is, if anybody sees him appear in public, if anybody knows where he's staying, you come and tell us at the Sanhedrin, the religious council. You come and tell us because we want to take him into custody. And so when we get to chapter 12, Jesus is laying low. He's not making public appearances in the temple courts. He's not performing public miracles. He's not delivering public teaching. He's spending time in the quiet with his disciples. And chapter 12 says, Jesus came to the home of his friend Lazarus and Lazarus' sisters, Martha and Mary. And Martha hosted a dinner with Jesus as the guest of honor. It's easy for me to imagine why Martha would want to do this, isn't it for you? It's easy for me to put myself in Martha's shoes and to say, wow, if somebody had blessed my family the way that Jesus just blessed her family, I would want to put on a big celebratory party meal as well. Every time Martha looked at her brother who was dead and is now alive again, she must have been just overwhelmed with appreciation and gratitude for the fact that Jesus had simply shown up and shared his power with them. And so when Jesus was in town again, she gave Jesus a party. She was doing something beautiful to demonstrate her love and her gratitude for Jesus. But she's not the only one. Because in John chapter 12, verse 3, John tells us that Martha's sister Mary took about a pint of pure nard, which was an expensive perfume, and she poured this perfume on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And John says the house, John was there. John remembers the smell. He remembers the scene. He says the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. And it's important to pay attention to a few details here in just this one verse. It'll help you understand something about the significance of this demonstration of love that Mary was sharing with Jesus. We're told here that the perfume was very expensive, but in the next few verses, we're going to discover that a whole pint of this was probably worth about 1 year's wages for a common worker. This is not a common toiletry item. This is not an everyday scent. This is an investment that most people would never see and could certainly never afford. We're not even sure how Mary acquired this. We're not sure if this was something that she bought expressly for Jesus. We're not sure if this was something that they bought to prepare Lazarus's body to be put in the grave and then they just had some left over. We're not sure. Maybe this was a family heirloom, something that had been passed down from generation to generation through their family. But what we know is that Mary used it liberally. That Mary didn't hold anything back. That she used a pint of perfume to wash Jesus' feet. Now keep in mind, a pint is 16 ounces. Almost as much liquid as like a typical one-use disposable water bottle that you'd buy, at the grocery store. I've got a bottle of cologne on my bathroom counter at home, and that bottle's just 3.3 ounces, and it's lasted me for months and months, using a spray or two every day. But Mary used 16 ounces. More than 4 of those bottles like I have. Mary used 16 ounces of this perfume on Jesus' feet. And it's so aromatic that John he sounds like he can still remember what it smelled like. He can still remember how it pervaded his nostrils. He can remember the fragrance filling the entire house. And you've got to imagine that this scene created a bit of a spectacle. You've got to imagine that even in a private home, with only Jesus' closest friends gathered around the table, that this must have been something odd to behold. It must have been strange to see Mary bowed down low enough to the ground that she could use her hair to wipe Jesus' feet. I suspect that it probably felt awkward for everyone else around the table to wait while Mary offered this individual moment of worship to Jesus. If she had walked in wearing a gold sequined hat and a gold glittered denim jacket and golden pants, singing at the top of her lungs, it wouldn't have been much different. But can you fault Mary for wanting to honor Jesus like this? I mean, when you think about what Mary has experienced, when you think about what the last few days and weeks have been like, when you think about what it was like for her to go through witnessing her brother's illness as it progressed and got more and more and more serious, and eventually the illness took her brother's life, and she had hoped, she had wished that maybe Jesus would arrive back in town in time to save her brother before the illness took his life. But then he died, and Jesus didn't make it in time, and there was some despair that washed over her. And then when Jesus showed up and asked for the tombstone to be removed, the rock over the entrance to the tomb, when Jesus showed up and they said, well, it's no use anymore. He's been dead a long time. He's been in there 4 days. But that wasn't enough to stop Jesus. And so can you fault Mary for wanting to honor Jesus like this? Can you blame her for wanting to do something extravagant for the man who restored the life of her brother? Can you blame her for wanting to do something extravagant for the one who restored the life of the male leader of her family, who provides some kind of social security in that culture for her? This moment may have been like nothing that the witnesses had ever seen before. This was probably like something that Mary had never, ever done before. But then again, Jesus had done something for Mary's family that nobody had ever seen before. And when you look at it that way, Mary's generous gesture, makes a lot of sense here, doesn't it? That didn't stop it from stirring up some controversy, though, of course. In verse 4, John writes that one of Jesus' disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray Jesus, objected when he saw what Mary was doing, and Judas asked, "Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages." Judas sounds pretty practical here, right? And if you take it at face value, you might have a little sympathy for his objection. You might kind of think to yourself, yeah, I was kind of wondering the same thing. You might think Judas is being pretty practical, pretty prudent here. I mean, why use 16 ounces of perfume when just a few drops will make things smell better too? Judas sounds noble. He sounds wise. He sounds strategic here. It's as if Judas is interested in pushing back against systemic poverty, and he sees this opportunity that in his eyes, it was wasted. But John lets us in on this little secret. In verse 6, he writes that Judas actually didn't say that because he cared about the poor. He said that because Judas himself was a thief. He was the one who was the treasurer for Jesus' ministry group. And John says Judas was known to sometimes embezzle funds that were meant to support Jesus' work. And so it appeared to John that Judas was actually hoping the money would be donated. He wished that the money had been donated to the ministry so that he would have had a bigger piggy bank to steal from, to dip his fingers into, and Judas's heart doesn't seem to be in the right place to begin with. But Jesus makes his position clear. He says to Judas, he says, leave Mary alone. And then he said something that reminded everybody in the room about the larger story that was playing out, about the road that he'd been prophesying to them that he was going to travel, about how serious things were going to get. He said, it was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. He reminds everybody that the primary reason people buy and used nard was to prepare a body to be entombed, was to prepare the body of someone whose life would be missed. Jesus framed Mary's act of worship as an act of devotion to someone who was about to sacrifice their life, someone who was about to lose their life. And you have to wonder if Mary was connecting the dots. You have to wonder if she realized that when Jesus decided to come to Bethany, that it meant he was coming to sacrifice himself. You have to wonder if maybe Thomas pulled her aside at some point and said, you know, we're all really glad about what happened to your brother here, but I want to make sure you understand that we all think this is going to turn out terribly. You have to wonder if Mary's connecting all the dots there, and if she's starting to put together, if she's the one who maybe realizes better than anybody else at this point that what Jesus has done was more than just show up and save her brother. What Jesus had done was to show up and save her brother at the cost of his own freedom, at the cost of his own life. Whatever Mary knew, it's clear that she was so moved by what Jesus had done for her that she was willing to be extravagantly generous. She was willing to risk being scrutinized. She was willing to make a scene. She was unashamed to pour out her love for Jesus in front of everybody else because Jesus meant everything to her. And I want to tell you this morning, I think that's what being devoted to God with your life looks like. I think being devoted to God means living your life in response to what God has done for you. That being devoted to God means that when you decide how you're going to engage the world, when you decide how you're going to present yourself to others, when you decide how you're going to invest your time and your energy and your resources, when you decide what kind of person you're going to be, the first factor that plays into all of those decisions is, how did Jesus share himself with me? What did God do to devote himself to me? There's a moment in the Toy Story movie, to add a little bit of levity. Maybe you remember a moment when there's all of these little squishy space aliens that had been in one of the claw machines. And at one point, the Mr. Potato Head toy saves their lives as they're about to be destroyed. And there's 3 of these little aliens that keep following him around. And every time they get his attention, they say to him, "You have saved our lives, and we are eternally grateful." That's pretty good theology, isn't it? You have saved our lives, and we are eternally grateful. You know, that entire room at that dinner at Martha's house, that entire room was full of disciples of Jesus. The 12 original disciples were there. Peter, Andrew, James, and John, Philip, and Bartholomew, and all the rest. All of those 12 were there, including Judas. Those 12 were in the room, but don't forget, don't start to believe that the only disciples that were following Jesus were just those 12 people. Martha and Mary and Lazarus were disciples of Jesus. There were others who were followers who had dedicated their lives to being part of Jesus' ministry, who wanted to be in his orbit. There were a bunch of people who were disciples of Jesus, and the room was full of them that night. People who had been with Jesus through thick and thin. People who had heard what Jesus taught. People who had heard Jesus say difficult things in front of large crowds who said, "Nah, we're not interested in that," but those disciples stuck with it. The room was full of people who had witnessed miracles, who remembered what it felt like to be in a boat in the midst of a raging storm at sea, and suddenly to hear Jesus say, "Peace, be still," and for the sea to go flat calm and the wind to die down. They remember what it tasted like when they ate loaves and fishes that Jesus had multiplied enough to feed a huge group, over 5,000 people. They remembered what it looked like to see the joy on somebody's face when they had spent their entire lifetime blind, and because they met Jesus, they walked around with the ability to see. These people in that room remembered what a difference Jesus had made in their lives and before their very eyes. But there were two different perspectives, at least two different perspectives that were happening in that room, right? Because you got Mary on the one hand. Mary, who's reflecting on everything that Jesus had done and everything that Jesus meant and everything that she had seen and heard and witnessed and experienced, everything that her brother had been through. She had sat listening to her brother talk about his first moment of consciousness after he came back from the grave. And as she processed all of that, she could not help but live her life in grateful response to Jesus. But then there's Judas. And Judas had been there for all of that stuff too. Judas was Lazarus' friend. Judas saw his friend rise from the grave. Judas was in the boat. Judas saw the blind people who could see. He saw the lame people who could suddenly walk. Judas knew what that fish and those loaves tasted like. But somehow there was a breakdown. Somehow there was a breakdown, a block, a hurdle in his heart that was keeping him from being able to connect with what Jesus had done and who Jesus was. There was something that was standing in the way that made Judas able to be called a disciple, but not live a life that was devoted to God. And the question I want to ask you this morning is, which direction is your heart headed? Because I believe it really is it's a continuum, it's a spectrum, there's different points in our spiritual journey, and we, because of our human frailty and our weakness, we ebb and flow. And we have moments in our lives, spiritual mountaintop moments, where we can easily put ourselves in Mary's shoes and say, I want God to know about my love, and I don't care who sees, and I don't care what it costs. And then we can have moments in our spiritual lives where we're fearful, and where we're skeptical, and where we're doubtful, and where we think we know better. And the question is not which end of the spectrum are you on? Are you a Mary or a Judas? What I'm interested in is which direction is the trajectory of your heart moving? Which direction is your heart headed? Some of you would be familiar with the name Alexander Solzhenitsyn, and I hope I'm pronouncing it exactly right. I've heard it a bunch of different ways, but he was a Russian soldier in the 20th century who was part of the Russian army during World War II, and while he was part of the Russian army fighting in Eastern Europe, in Germany, and in Poland, he witnessed atrocities and war crimes that made him embarrassed to be a part of the Russian armed forces. And later he was sent to the Gulag for actually writing critically about the Russian state. He said at one point in his most famous writing, he said, "The line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes of people, nor between political parties either. The line between good and evil runs right through every human heart and through all human hearts." He said the line shifts. Inside of us, it oscillates with the years. We have moments when our life is headed toward good and moments when our life is headed toward evil. And even within our hearts, he said, overwhelmed by evil, one small bridgehead of good is retained. This person who had seen evil up close, who had been a part of acts of evil that he deeply regretted and was ashamed about, he recognized that each and every one of us has the capacity to live a life that's devoted to goodness or to live a life that's devoted toward evil. That each and every one of us has the capacity to live the life God designed or to turn our backs on the way that God designed. And he recognized that in this life we will fluctuate back and forth. But the question at stake, the question that we have to decide is, which way do I want my life to go? Which way do I want my heart to go? How do I want to direct and lead my own heart? Will I be someone who is wholeheartedly devoted to God? In Romans chapter 12, Paul wrote to the church in Rome, Christians that he'd never met before in person, and he said to them, he said, "I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy." Now stop right there and don't read ahead, but let me just explain to you that what Paul is saying there is, because of the goodness of God. I urge you, brothers and sisters, because of who God has been and what God has done and what God means to you, I urge you, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. I urge you, he says, to offer your bodies. To give like the most important thing you've got. To give the thing that's like makes you you. Paul says, I urge you to offer your whole self to God because of God's goodness. Anybody want to give some perfume instead? That seems like it'd be cheaper, like it'd be easier. But that's not what God's after. God's after a life of devotion. God's after a heart that puts God first. And Paul says this is what true and proper worship looks like. One of my favorite parts of my week is that on Mondays in our church staff meetings, we spend time telling Yay God stories. We talk about what are the things that we've seen God doing in our midst. What are the things that we see God up to in our church family that seem like they are just absolutely kingdom kind of things. And this last Monday, I heard a story about two twin boys in our preschool program here on Sunday mornings who decided that they wanted to give from their piggy banks to support our ministry called That Was Me Kids. It's the ministry where we feed hungry children in Keller ISD who don't have food at home on the weekends. And so the Sunday a couple of weeks ago, one of these twin boys, though I think I'm telling the story right, that one of these twin boys brought like $14 or something, which for a 4 or 5-year-old, that's a pretty significant offering, right? And then the following Sunday, I think the story goes that the twin brother brought $47. And you want to think, well, did they steal this from mom and dad, you know? But when the teacher asked, where did this money come from? The boy said, it was all the money I had in my wallet. Can you imagine? Can you imagine a life, a heart, a spirit that says, God means so much to me, and caring for God's people means so much to me, that I'm willing to share something that's more valuable than I thought I'd ever share before? Can you imagine a pint of expensive perfume? Can you imagine offering your body as a living sacrifice devoted to God all day, every day? Can you imagine? I think the answer is for us to ask Jesus to help us imagine. Because in the moments when we find ourselves cynical, in the moments when we find ourselves doubtful, and in the moments when we find ourselves afraid, in the moments when we think we know better, maybe what's happened is that we've lost sight of what God has done for us. Let's keep our eyes fixed on Jesus together so that we can live lives of devotion as a church family.